Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Today, we're going back to the Cold War. But
Sure.
don't worry, no need to be a history expert or anything like that for this one. We're looking at détente. You know, that time the U.S. and the Soviet Union tried, or at least said they'd try, to dial back the whole global superpower standoff thing.
Right, exactly.
We've got a really interesting podcast we're using as our guide for this one, aimed at high schoolers, actually. So we're getting like a super clear and concise version of all this complex history, which is nice.
Yeah, definitely.
And here's the thing.
Okay.
Even when both sides were like, hey, let's all just chill out a bit, it turns out things were way more complicated and honestly way more interesting than that. Like way more going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head because détente wasn't like this magical, now we're best buds situation. It was more like this carefully built web of agreements, right? Meant to try and manage this very real rivalry they had going on. And both superpowers, I mean, they went into it with some serious baggage and anxieties.
Okay, so anxieties about trusting each other, anxieties about what the other guy was really planning. Got it. So let's rewind then to the mid-1970s.
Okay.
What were some of those early warning signs, the things that made both sides start getting cold feet?
Let me see. Well, for the U.S., one of the biggest red flags was this whole thing with the Soviets and their nuclear arsenal, kept building it up, especially those ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Right, those are the scary ones.
Yeah, exactly. And this was despite the strategic arms limitation talks, SALT-yeah, that were supposed to limit those weapons. But the Soviets they kept building them up.
So it's kind of like you agree to cut back on the sweets, try to be a little healthier, and then you catch the other person with a secret stash of candy. Not exactly building a lot of trust there, is it?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, the U.S. felt like the Soviets were just using détente as a cover while they secretly raced to catch up in the arms race. And it played right into those existing fears about whether the Soviets could be trusted at all, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Really fed into that whole, are they really going to stick to the plan feeling in the U.S.?
And it wasn't only about nukes, was it? The podcast mentions the Soviets getting more active in Africa around this time too, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. During the whole détente period, the Soviets were getting involved with, well, providing support, you could say, to a lot of these left-leaning movements and governments in Africa and Angola, Ethiopia, places like that.
And how did that go over in Washington? How'd the U.S. see that?
Not well. I mean, Put yourself in their shoes, right? From the U.S. perspective, it looked a whole lot like the Soviets were trying to use this time when everyone was supposed to be cooling things down to spread their influence even more. Definitely fueled a ton of anxiety and, frankly, suspicion in Washington.
It does sound like the U.S. had its reasons to be a little wary, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I gotta imagine the Soviets weren't exactly doing cartwheels over how the U.S. was acting either, right?
Oh, you're totally right. The Soviets had their own list of grievances, and they were definitely not afraid to point out where they saw hypocrisy from the U.S. Straight up called them out.
Oh, I knew there had to be some drama. Okay, give me the good stuff. What was the Soviet Union most upset about? Spill the tea.
Well, a big one was this whole thing with America and how they were getting involved in the developing world. The Soviets saw that as incredibly hypocritical. Like, the U.S. would be criticizing them for, say, backing a left-leaning government somewhere, but then at the exact same time, they were over there supporting anti-communist regimes like Pinochet in Chile.
Yeah.
Not a great look.
Yeah, bit of a double standard there.
Exactly. And the Soviets knew it. It's like they were saying, hold on, you're doing the same stuff you're criticizing us for. Created a lot of resentment, you know, and it made them question whether the U.S. was really serious about this whole détente thing at all. Made it seem like the U.S. just wanted to call all the shots, you know?
So it's less about one side being the good guys and more like everyone's got their own agenda.
Exactly. And that's a really important thing to remember. International relations are rarely black and white. Each of these superpowers, they had their own motivations, their own anxieties, all shaped by their history, their worldview, and what they thought was best for their own interests.
And sometimes those interests, they clash, even when you're trying to, find some common ground.
Yeah, you got it.
This is where it gets even more complicated, though, right?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just political maneuvering happening. The podcast mentioned some pretty serious economic stuff that was adding fuel to this fire. What was going on there? How was the whole economic situation impacting things?
So picture this. By the time you get to the late 1970s, the U.S. economy, it's starting to bounce back. Things are looking up, you know. But over in the Soviet Union, it's a different story. Their economy is facing some big challenges. Technologically, they're falling behind, and their whole system, it's just not really built for this globalized world. They're struggling to keep up.
So imagine you're trying to make a deal with someone, but you're feeling super financially insecure, and meanwhile, they seem like they're doing better than ever. Not exactly a recipe for a smooth negotiation, is it?
You got it. That economic gap, it created this sense of vulnerability for the Soviets, and it probably had a big impact on their decision-making, don't you think? It's like they might have felt like they needed to take bigger risks, make bolder moves to make up for that economic weakness, which, and here's the irony, actually ended up making the whole détente thing even more unstable.
Man, what a mess. And we haven't even gotten to the big one yet, the thing that really blew everything up. The Soviets deciding to invade Afghanistan. So we were talking about how the whole economic situation was making things kind of shaky.
Yeah, definitely not helping.
And then, bam, 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Talk about shattering that already fragile détente thing, huh?
Yeah, no kidding. It was a huge turning point, Like, suddenly, a lot of those fears people in the U.S. had about the Soviets, about what they were really after, it all seemed to be confirmed. Here they were, being aggressive, totally went against that whole idea of cooperation and trying to limit arms and everything détente was supposed to be about.
Right, it's like you're all set for this relaxing spa day, you're ready to chill out, and bam, someone throws you into an ice bath. Not exactly what you signed up for.
Exactly. And for the U.S. government, this was serious stuff. They saw this invasion and they're thinking this could be a threat to the whole region, especially with the Middle East right there, all that oil,
Yeah.
Super strategically important area.
Makes sense. And that's got to be where we get President Carter and that famous doctrine of his, right?
Bingo. Carter Doctrine. Announced in 1980. Basically what he's saying is the Persian Gulf, that's a vital U.S. interest, okay? And if any outside power, cough, cough, Soviets, cough, even thinks about trying to muscle their way in there, well, the U.S. is ready to use military force to stop them. No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Drawing a line in the sand, huh? Don't even think about messing with us or our interests.
You got it. Big shift in U.S. foreign policy right there. Détente, out the window. Now it's all about being ready to confront the Soviets head on. And they put their money where their mouth was, too. Started sending weapons and aid to the Afghan fighters going up against the Soviets, boycotted the Olympics they were supposed to have in Moscow in 1980, even hit them with economic sanctions. The gloves were off.
So in what, like 5 years, we go from everyone being cautiously optimistic, talking about limiting weapons, to this huge international crisis. Crazy how quickly things can change. But it also makes you wonder, was détente ever really a real possibility in the first place? Given how much mistrust there was, all the tensions bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And historians, they've been going back and forth about it for decades. And like most things in history, there's no easy answer. It's complicated.
Well, let's unpack some of that complexity then, shall we? The podcast mentioned something about Orthodox and revisionist viewpoints on this whole thing. What's that all about?
Right, so the Orthodox view, that was kind of the dominant one in the West, especially during the Cold War. And their take was basically blame the Soviets. They were the bad guys. They were always planning to expand their influence. And détente was just this way for them to stall for time, like pretend to be chill while secretly trying to take advantage of the West.
So the Orthodox historians, they saw it as the Soviets playing everyone else for fools.
Pretty much. But then you get this new wave of historians starting in the 60s and 70s calling themselves revisionists, and they're like, hold on a minute, not so fast. They're saying the U.S. deserves a good chunk of the blame for détente falling apart, too.
Okay, so I'm guessing they had a very different interpretation of what happened.
Oh, yeah, totally different. The revisionists, they point to things like the Vietnam War, the U.S. getting involved in all these messy situations in Latin America, supporting some pretty brutal regimes there just to stop the spread of communism. And they're saying, look, this doesn't exactly scream peaceful coexistence, does it? They argued that these U.S. actions actually pushed the Soviets to be more aggressive, made them feel like they had to respond in kind, like with Afghanistan.
So it's the chicken or the egg thing. Who is really the aggressor here?
Exactly. And if that wasn't complicated enough, then you've got another group, the post-revisionists. They're trying to move past this whole blame game, who started it. They're saying détente failed because both sides sucked at communicating, there were all these misunderstandings, and fundamentally, they just didn't trust each other.
So less about deliberate aggression, more like they just couldn't get on the same page.
Exactly. The post-revisionists, they emphasized that both superpowers, they were living in this world of fear, suspicion, always thinking the worst of each other. They'd see the other guy do something, and their minds would just go to the darkest possible interpretation.
Mm.
Not exactly a recipe for successful diplomacy, right?
Yeah, kind of like when you get into those arguments where it's just a total communication breakdown, except in this case, the stakes were, well, a tad higher than your average fight with your roommate.
No kidding. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapses in 91, and suddenly historians have access to all these secret Soviet archives they could only dream about before. Talk about a game changer. Now they can really try to get inside the heads of the Soviet leadership.
Okay, so what did those secret files tell us? Did they back up any of these theories? Spill the tea?
Oh, they were a gold mine of information, those archives. Gave historians this whole new perspective on what was going on in the Kremlin during this period. And one of the biggest revelations, one that really jumps out, is just how badly the Soviet Union was doing economically. They were in deep, man, facing some serious problems at home, stuff that wasn't always obvious to the outside world.
So even though they were this superpower, they weren't invincible. They had their own weaknesses, just like everyone else.
Absolutely. And those economic problems, you better believe they played a role in how the Soviets were acting on the world stage. It's all connected.
That makes sense. When your bank account's looking a little empty, you're probably more likely to gamble on a risky move, right? Hoping for a big win.
Exactly. And some historians, they're making the case that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which, let's be real, turned out to be a total disaster for them in the long run, well, they're saying part of why they did it was out of desperation. They needed a win, something to boost their position, especially with their economy in the tank, made them act rashly.
So it wasn't just about Cold War ideology, about trying to spread communism everywhere. It was also about cold, hard cash, or the lack of it.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that international relations, it's not just some game played by guys in suits. It's about real people, real lives, and sometimes those real-life problems, like a struggling economy, they can have a huge impact on how countries act, can even lead to some major miscalculations.
It's like détente. It was this perfect storm of messed up stuff. All that built-up mistrust, those underlying economic anxieties, and then, yes, some major miscalculations by pretty much everyone involved.
You nailed it. And it's a cautionary tale. It shows just how complex international relations really are, and it teaches us some valuable lessons about how important it is to talk to each other, to try and understand where the other side is coming from, even when you don't agree with them, and to not underestimate the impact of things like economics. It all matters.
It's amazing, though, right? How having these documents, these firsthand accounts from back then, it totally changes how we see this whole period.
Yeah, it's like getting a whole new piece of the puzzle, changes how everything fits together.
Makes you realize we've still only scratched the surface of why things went so wrong with détente. It reminds me, history, it's never simple, is it?
Oh, never. There's always more to the story, always different sides, hidden agendas, stuff people didn't intend to happen, but it did anyway. And you know what? That's actually what makes studying this stuff so interesting.
It really is. And it makes you think about the world today. With everything going on, all the countries kind of sizing each other up, forming alliances, those tensions simmering under the surface. Kind of scary if you think about it too much, right? Because if even superpowers, with all their resources and smarts, if they can mess up this badly, misunderstand each other to the point where it all blows up, what does that mean for us today? How are we supposed to deal with all the global stuff we've got going on?
It's a big question, no doubt about it, but I think what it highlights, more than anything, is how crucial it is to talk to each other. Like, really talk. Try to understand where the other side's coming from, what their concerns are, even if you don't agree with them. And having empathy, that's huge. Putting yourself in the other guy's shoes. Détente, it shows what happens when that breaks down. Doesn't mean you have to be best buddies, but you got to at least try to get where they're coming from.
Yeah, makes sense. So if our listeners take away one big thing from all this, from our deep dive into détente, what should it be?
That's a tough one. I guess it'd be this. Even when everyone's saying they want peace, that they want stability, things can still go very, very wrong. Human nature being what it is, right? Détente shows that misunderstandings happen, conflicts flare up, even when nobody really wants them to. So stay vigilant, I guess is what I'm saying. Question everything, don't just accept the easy answers, and be aware that things are rarely as simple as they seem.
Couldn't put it better myself. Well, that's about it for our deep dive into this whole U.S.-Soviet détente thing. We saw how even when both sides were supposedly looking for a way to chill out, to ease the tension, there was just too much baggage, too much mistrust. And in the end, it all fell apart.
Yep, a time of both promise and danger, that's for sure. And the lessons we can learn from it, they're still relevant today. Maybe even more so, with everything that's going on in the world.
That's the truth. To all our listeners out there, we hope you enjoy this deep dive and that it inspires you to keep asking questions, keep learning, keep trying to see things from different angles. The world's a complicated place, but hey, that's what makes it so interesting, right? Until next time, keep those brains switched on, and we'll catch you on the flip side.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.